Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. Today is October 9th, so we have Thursday Night Football, which is Philadelphia at the Giants. So there's a couple things to update, but we'll just jump into it and cover it when we get there. So looking at our team panel, you have Philadelphia at the Giants, with Philadelphia favored on the money line, a spread of 7 points, and a total line of 40.5 points. The one thing to show here before we get too far into this is that I added a depth chart. If I bring it up, you can see the position just kind of like you would with like an ESPN or something like that. Eventually, I want to be able to click on these and compare different players along the team. I'm going to add some buttons, hopefully for the weekend games, where you can see the entire list of like all three receivers that match up and what their defensive counterparts look like. But getting back into our usual kind of setup, you have Philadelphia with a passing rank of 31, a rushing rank of 25, an allowed passing rank of 12, and an allowed rushing rank of 22. You have the Giants with a passing rank of 19, a rushing rank of 18, an allowed passing rank of 23, and an allowed rushing rank of 26. Just again, jumping through all the averages for the team, Philadelphia gets 177.8 passing yards per game, almost 100 rushing yards per game. They've had no interceptions and average 3 sacks suffered per game. The Giants average almost 220 passing yards per game, 117 rushing yards per game. They do average 1 passing interception per game, and they average almost the same 3 sacks suffered per game. Defensively, Philadelphia allows 220 passing yards per game and almost 127 rushing yards per game, while the Giants allow 253 passing yards per game and 140 rushing yards per game. Philadelphia has averaged 5.4 QB hits per game, while the Giants have one more on average at 6.4. They both average 0.6 interceptions per game. That means a total of 3 interceptions for them on their defense for both teams. And they both average below 2 defensive sacks per game. Looking into our quarterbacks, you have Jalen Hurts for Philadelphia and Jason Dart for the Giants. Hurts has 103.8 fantasy points this season. That averages 20.7 per game. Jason Dart has 35.4 fantasy points this season. Comes out to an average of 8.8, but I think that's incorrect due to the fact that he has 2 games listed in the first 2, but doesn't have any passing yards. So a little bit of a red herring there. I'll have to maybe see if I can fix that and change that so that the averages are a little bit more accurate. Even so, in week 4, having 111 passing yards, coming in maybe halfway through the game or something like that, that's still going to change that average quite a bit from what you might normally see from a quarterback. So just keep that in mind as we go through Jason Dart's sort of averages here. Looking at turnovers, you have no passing interceptions from Hurts. He did lose 1 sack fumble, but that's it, so 1 turnover on the year. However, Hurts has suffered 15 sacks this season. With Jackson Dart, he's had 2 passing interceptions, 6 sacks suffered, and 1 sack fumble loss, for a total of 3 turnovers. We'll start with Jalen Hurts' averages, since those actually will work out. You have Hurts' average at 177.8 passing yards, and he averages 36.4 rushing yards per game. His worst week was week 2 with 101 passing yards, and best week last week with 280 passing yards. With Jackson Dart, you can see that the averages get really pulled down to 78.25, but that's not really accurate. 313 total passing yards on the year, so that average comes in to about 150 or so, a little bit more, 160. Rushing yards, 109 rushing yards total on the season. That's what makes things a little confusing here, because he did have a rush in each of the first 2 games, 1 carry, minus 3 yards, averages to 0, so that will confuse things. We'll have to figure out how to deal with that probably. Maybe if we look at outliers and remove those, that might be the best way to approach that. But otherwise, he averages right around that 55 rushing yards per game. And if we look at the running backs, you have Saquon Barkley for Philadelphia and Cam Skattebo for the Giants. Barkley has 63.5 fantasy points, 80.5 in PPR. That's an average of 12.7 fantasy points, or 16.1 in PPR. Cam Skattebo has 50.3 fantasy points, 68.3 PPR. That's an average of 10 fantasy points per game, or 13.6 in PPR. The only turnovers with these two is Cam with a rushing fumble. On average, Saquon gets 53.4 rushing yards per game and 25.6 receiving yards per game. He did have his season low last week against Denver with 30 rushing yards, and his season high is 88 rushing yards in week 2. So Cam gets 48 rushing yards per game on average, 28.6 receiving yards per game on average. I do think that gets a little messed up from week 1 here, where he only gets minus 3 rushing yards on 2 carries. So that's a bit of an outlier that maybe I should figure out how to remove because it definitely pulls down his average. Because otherwise, his best week's been week 4 with 79 rushing yards, and the last 3 games have been 60, 79, and 59. So averaging closer to that 60, upper 60 level over the last 3 games. Also to note, in week 3 he had 61 receiving yards. Last week 45. So he might become more of a receiving back over time with Dart being the starter now. Looking into the receivers, you have A.J. Brown for Philadelphia and Wandale Robinson, who's now the starter in place of Malik Neighbors. With fantasy, A.J. Brown has 25.4 fantasy points, 44.4 PPR. That's an average of 5.8 fantasy points, or 8.8 in PPR. Robinson has 32.9 fantasy points, 55.9 in PPR. That's an average of 6.58 in fantasy points, or 11.1 in PPR. Neither of these players have any turnovers. And looking at the averages, you have A.J. Brown with 38.8 receiving yards on average per game, and Robinson gets 53.4 receiving yards per game on average. A.J. Brown's worst week, surprisingly, was not week 1, but week 4 with only 7 receiving yards, where week 1 he only had that 1 reception for 8 yards. Best week being week 3 with 109 yards. Otherwise, 43 and 27 have been his other numbers. So kind of all over the place with A.J. Brown right now, even though that still gives him a pretty good large share, almost a third of the share of yards. This, by the way, is something else I need to fix where we can change this and it's all properly labeled and easier to read. Robinson's worst week was week 4 with 14 receiving yards. His best week was week 2 with 142 receiving yards, and otherwise stayed about in that middle 26, 30, 55 range. That gives him about a 21.5% share of the receiving yards on the team. This other larger portion was Malik Neighbors, so he still owns quite a large share of the receiving yards, but that's to be expected. Even though he had it, he's now out. He still owns that share. So slowly, Robinson will probably take more of that share, as well as some of the other players that need to fill in for Neighbors. And then looking at our tight ends finally, you have Dallas Goedert for Philadelphia and Theo Johnson for the Giants. Goedert has 37.3 fantasy points, 52.3 in PPR. That's an average of 9.3 or 13.1 in PPR. Theo has had 27.9 fantasy points this season, 42.9 in PPR. That's an average of 5.6 fantasy points, or 8.6 in PPR. Neither tight end has had any turnovers. So Goddard gets 33.2 receiving yards per game on average, while Theo gets 19.8 on average. Week by week, Goddard's been fairly consistent, even though his worst week was week 4? Week 5. He missed week 2. Yeah, so his worst week was last week with 19 receiving yards. Otherwise, he stayed in that mid-30s. 44, week 1 was his best week. That does still give him about 16.7% of the receiving share. With Theo Johnson, his worst week was week 1 with 5 receiving yards. His best week was week 2 with 34 receiving yards. And last week was really close with 33 receiving yards. Otherwise, he's been around 10 and 17 receiving yards. So a little lower average. You can see that's a smaller slice of the pie. The numbers don't quite come out correctly. And that gives him about 8 to 10% of his team's receiving yards. Alright, and that's all I have for this game. I hope that you enjoyed. I do plan to make some more bigger updates soon, especially with the defense. I'm also looking to make some more breakdown information between how many receiving yards like a tight end gets versus the receivers, just to show that at a higher level at the team page to know right off the bat whether the team favors their tight ends more or something like a wide receiver or their running backs. So I think I'll have more breakdowns of that soon. Otherwise, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope this gave you some useful information. If you did, like and subscribe, and leave a comment on what else you would want to see if I did miss something. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.